From the last shores of the South Sea to the frozen wilderness of the South Atlantic, the Resolution sails into a world of whales, storms, and uncharted land, where even survival itself begins to feel uncertain. Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. In this podcast, I explore historical journeys and travel accounts that shaped how Europeans came to understand the world. This series follows the second voyage of Captain James Cook and the young naturalist Georg Forster through the Pacific in the 18th century. What happened in the last episode? They had reached the desolate coasts of Tierra del Fuego, where snow-covered mountains and barren islands rose straight from the sea. In Christmas Sound, they found shelter, fresh water, and just enough food, birds, shellfish, and wild plants to sustain the crew in this harsh environment. During their stay, they encountered local inhabitants, the so-called pêcherets, whose way of life in the cold scarcity deeply unsettled the Europeans. Their appearance, diet, and seeming indifference challenged Georg's understanding of human society and led him to question the idea that life in a natural state could be happy or desirable. As the days passed, the crew gathered supplies and made ready to depart. With the ship restored and provisions secured, they left Christmas Sound behind, now heading toward the most feared stretch of their journey, Cape Horn. December 28th, 1774, Christmas Sound, Tierra del Fuego.
The harbor they now left was given the name Christmas Sound. In German, Weihnachtshafen. It is favorably located for ships coming from or heading into the South Sea, and, due to the available provisions, can be recommended as a good anchorage. There are many excellent bays, and though no timber for building is found, there is an abundance of firewood. The water is clear and pleasant to the taste, and the air, though somewhat harsh, is healthy. During the stay, a Marine soldier drowned. He was not missed until 2 days later. It was found that, while drunk, he had climbed over the railing at the bow to relieve himself and had fallen into the sea. The same man had nearly drowned once before on Erromanga and had shot one of the islanders on Tanna. This was the fourth and final death on the entire voyage. In the afternoon, they sailed past the island of San Ildefonso, which was presumably named by Spanish seafarers. Beyond it, they held an eastward course until nightfall and tacked back and forth throughout the night. The next morning at 6 o'clock, they passed Cape Horn, the great southern rocky point of Hermite Island, named after its discoverer. The geographical position of this famous cape had always been reported incorrectly, but now, based on the observations Captain Cook had made on his 2 world voyages, it could be determined with certainty. 55 degrees, 58 minutes south latitude, and 67 degrees 46 minutes west longitude. With this, they had fully left the South Sea behind and set course for the Le Maire Strait between Tierra del Fuego and Staten Island. By evening, they came close enough to observe that this part of Tierra del Fuego had a far better appearance than the region around Christmas Sound. The mountains were not as steep, but stretched long and gently down to the sea, where they ended in low, forested ridges. Snow was barely visible, if at all, except on the most distant western peaks.
Friday, December 30th, 1774, Cape Horn.
In the morning, they reached the strait, but were held up the entire day by a dead calm. Success Bay lay directly opposite, and the expansive shores appeared so fertile and pleasant that the men wished they could land there. At 2 in the afternoon, while the men were at their meal, the captain sent out a boat to see whether the Adventure might have anchored in that bay or left behind any message. Meanwhile, the ship tacked back and forth under a very light wind, so as not to stray too far from the boat. Around 30 large whales and countless seals were playing in the waters around the ship. The whales mostly swam in pairs, suggesting this was their mating season. Whenever they exhaled on the windward side of the ship, the men had to endure a foul and unhealthy stench that lingered for 3 to 4 minutes. At times, the animals rolled onto their backs and slapped the water with their long pectoral fins, producing a sound like the firing of a half-pounder cannon. This display may have given rise to the sailor's tale that the thresher fish and the whale sometimes engage in battle. The thresher is usually described as a long fish that leaps from the water to strike the whale with a violent blow. Storytellers often added the swordfish into the tale as well, claiming it used the opportunity to slash open the poor whale's belly. Because the animals were so close, the men could clearly see during their repeated movements that the inside of the fins and the underside of the body were white, while the rest of the body appeared black. One whale, barely 60 meters from the ship, rolled about in the water, showing many long folds or wrinkles along its belly. Despite their enormous size, no less than 12 meters in length and 3 meters in diameter, the whales could sometimes be seen leaping completely out of the water, each time crashing back with such force that the sea frothed all around. The sheer power required to lift such enormous creatures out of the water, along with the admirable construction of their bodies, offered much to contemplate. Around 6 in the evening, the boat sent to Success Bay returned. The lieutenant reported that countless seals had followed them all the way into the bay, and that whales had been so numerous there that the boat nearly collided with them. At the spot where Captain Cook had taken on water during his first world voyage, he found no sign that any European ship had been there since. As the men went ashore, they were met by a group of locals dressed in guanaco hides and long cloaks made of seal fur. They appeared friendly, far more cheerful and content than the wretched souls encountered in Christmas Sound. Some even wore reed bracelets wound with silver wire, and repeatedly pointed to them while saying the word pêcherai. Everything the men offered them was looked at with indifference, without the slightest sign of desire. The bracelets must have come either directly from passing Spaniards or indirectly through trade with other peoples living farther north. The men stayed only 2 or 3 minutes with them, then returned to their boat and hurried back to the ship. They now continued through the Le Maire Strait and, the following morning, sailed along the coast of Staten Island, which was shrouded in thick fog. Around midday the weather cleared, and the land came into clear view. It strongly resembled the west coast of Tierra del Fuego. Steep, barren, rocky mountains, though not as high, and thus covered with less snow. Some islands rose from the sea close to the coast, standing about 27 meters straight up from the water and appearing to be covered with grass on their peaks. Seals were abundant everywhere, and since their fat could be used just as well as blubber, Captain Cook decided to look for a suitable bay to collect a supply. Father Feuillet had published a map of these islands in his travel account, but it turned out to be highly inaccurate. As they sailed between the islands and Staten Island, they discovered a good bay on the latter, but the captain chose not to enter, fearing he might be trapped by adverse winds, and deemed it safer to anchor in the lee of one of the low islands instead. Since, by nautical reckoning, December 31st ended at noon, he named this group of islands the New Year's Isles, and the bay on Staten Island the New Year's Bay. Immediately after the midday meal, the men lowered the boats and rowed over to the island, which lay about 1.8 kilometers away. All along the rocky shore, countless seals were gathered. Some had long, shaggy manes and deserved the name sea lions far more than the smooth-skinned animals Lord Anson had so called on the island of Juan Fernandez. Even the older seafarers, whose works are now rarely read, had indeed referred to this type as sea lions. For their hunting ground, the men chose a bay protected by rocky cliffs against the force of the sea. They soon realized that, despite their fierce appearance, the animals were in fact less dangerous, for they usually plunged into the water at the first musket shot and tried to escape. Only the largest and clumsiest remained where they were, letting out constant roars as they were shot. A rain shower dampened their eagerness for a short while, but once the weather cleared again, the hunt resumed, and the men killed a great number of the fattest sea lions. The sailors knew how to handle them well. They struck them on the head with a club, dragged them into the boats, and brought them aboard, where the blubber was rendered into oil. The old males were almost all astonishingly fat, and measured between 3 and 3.6 meters in length. The females were slimmer, ranging from 1.8 to 2.4 meters. The largest sea lions weighed between 600 and 700 kilograms, and even a medium-sized animal, once skinned and gutted, still weighed 250 kilograms. The male's head indeed resembled that of a lion, and the coloration was nearly the same, just slightly darker. The long, shaggy hair around the neck and shoulders looked exactly like a lion's mane, coarse and stiff. The rest of the body was covered in short, sleek hair that formed a beautiful, even, and glossy coat. The female differed from the male in having a completely smooth body, but in the shape of the feet, or rather flippers, both sexes were identical. The fore flippers were made of large pieces of tough black leather, with several barely noticeable bumps in the center in place of nails. The hind flippers resembled feet more closely, also made of black leather, divided into 5 long toes, each bearing a small nail and tapering into a narrow strap. Though the nails were quite small, the animals made good use of them for scratching, as the men observed more than once. The tail was extremely short and hidden between the tightly pressed hind flippers. The hindquarters were especially large, rounded, and seemed to be covered in a layer of fat. Depending on age and sex, the animals produced different sounds, some so piercing that they made the men's ears ring. The old males snorted and roared like lions or wild oxen. The females bleated like calves, and the young sounded like lambs. On the beach, whole herds of young animals lay scattered everywhere. Likely this was their birthing season. One female met a particularly cruel fate. She gave birth at the very moment a sailor struck her on the head with a club. The animals lived together in numerous herds. Only the oldest and fattest males lay apart. Each chose a large rock as its resting place, which no other animal dared approach without provoking a bloody fight. Georg often observed them lunge at one another with indescribable fury and bite savagely, which explained the deep scars many bore on their backs. The younger, more agile sea lions lay peacefully among the females and young. During the hunt, they usually waited for the first attack, but once a few had been killed, the rest fled in a state of panic. Some females carried their young in their mouths, while others, more frightened, left them behind. When they believed themselves unobserved, they showed affection, gently nuzzling one another, their snouts touching as if in a kiss. The late Professor Steller had already described these animals on Bering Island near Kamchatka, where he had been shipwrecked. His accounts, still the first and best, agreed completely with what the men now observed. Don Pernetti also mentioned them in his voyage to the Falkland Islands, but the illustrations in his work, like most of his other drawings and descriptions, were completely inaccurate. Monsieur de Bougainville had likewise encountered them during his circumnavigation. In these uninhabited regions, the animals come ashore to give birth. During their time on land, which often lasts several weeks, they eat nothing. Instead of food, they swallow a number of stones to fill their stomachs, though this naturally causes them to grow quite emaciated. Some were found with empty stomachs, while others contained 10 to 12 round, heavy stones, each about the size of 2 fists. Once the sea lions had completely vacated the beach, the men climbed to the upper plateau of the island. It resembled a field full of molehills, covered with small knolls. On each of these mounds grew dense tufts of a type of grass known as cocksfoot, Dactylis glomerata. The hollows between the knolls were full of dung, so that the men had to leap from one mound to the next. Here they found another kind of seal which, having climbed up wet from the sea, had likely made the ground so filthy. These were actually fur seals, the same kind Georg and his companions had already seen in Dusky Bay, though there neither as numerous nor as large. Steller's description of these animals also proved entirely accurate. They were slightly smaller than sea lions, with the males reaching 8 to 9 feet in length, about 2.4 to 2.7 meters, and were proportionally thick. Their fur was dark brown, speckled with fine gray, and much longer than that of sea lions, though it did not form a mane. In all other aspects, body shape and structure of the flippers, both species were completely alike. The fur seals appeared far more aggressive than the sea lions. The females in particular defended their young and would sooner be struck down at their side than flee. On the same island, there were also many turkey vultures, vulture aura, which the sailors referred to as carrion crows. They likely fed on dead or man-killed young fur seals and sea lions. In addition, a kind of hawk was found there, along with geese of the same kind the men had so enjoyed at Christmas Sound, and penguins belonging to a species yet unknown. Large gray petrels, as big as albatrosses, were also seen. The Spanish called these birds quebranta huesos, which means bone breakers. Finally, the men also discovered cormorants on the island.
Sailors! Quickest sailors!
Sunday, January 1st, 1775, New Year Islands.
The new year began with a fresh breeze and cold air under a bright and cheerful sky. To avoid leaving nearby New Year Bay entirely unexplored, a boat was sent out to chart the coast and sound the anchorage. Georg and his companions would have liked to go along, but since Lieutenant Pickersgill, who commanded the boat, had strict orders not to go ashore at all, they chose instead to join the captain, who once again sailed to the nearby island. The island's geological layers consisted partly of yellow, clay-like rock and partly of gray slate, whose hardness varied depending on its formation. On the cliffs, despite yesterday's hunt, whole herds of fur seals and sea lions had settled once again. This time, they were left undisturbed, as another group had been sent out to hunt elsewhere. It was remarkable how the two species, though closely related, never mingled, always remaining strictly separated. Because of their strong odor, they could be smelled from afar, like all other kinds of seals. These traits had already been known in Homer's time, along with their laziness and drowsiness whenever they were on land. As the men traveled along the shore, they came upon a place where many thousands of cormorants were nesting on the already mentioned grassy mounds of earth. The opportunity to provide a meal for the entire crew could not be ignored. The birds were still so unfamiliar with humans that the sailors were able to club several hundred of them in a short time. Among them, they also discovered a bird of an entirely new kind. It belonged to the class of wading waterfowl, its toes partly connected by a type of webbing, and both its eyes and the base of its beak were surrounded by white glands or warts. They hoped it might be a delicacy, but the meat gave off such an unbearable stench that no one wanted to eat it, even though the men were certainly not picky at the time. Captain Cook determined the latitude at the eastern end of the island, which consisted of bare rock and was covered in countless seals, gulls, cormorants, and other seabirds. After having lunch on board, they returned to shore for more hunting. By chance, they managed to catch a few geese, including one of a new kind, and a flock of penguins they encountered met the same fate as the cormorants before midday. These penguins were about the size of geese. They belonged to the type commonly found around the Strait of Magellan, the same kind the English on the Falkland Islands had nicknamed Jumping Jack. They slept so soundly that one, over which Mr. Sparman tripped, knocking it several steps from its place, did not wake up until long after he had given it a vigorous shake. If an entire group was attacked at once, they would defend themselves, charging at the men and biting their legs. They were remarkably tough animals. Many, left for dead, soon got up again and waddled away quite seriously. The fur seals and sea lions, too, could not be killed with a single blow. Their snouts, however, were the most sensitive part, and they could barely defend themselves when struck there. Dr. Sparman and Georg nearly came to serious harm from an old sea bear. The animal was lying on a rock, and several hundred others behind it seemed to be waiting for the outcome of the fight. Mr. Sparman had just shot a bird and was about to pick it up, which required him to pass close by the old bear. The beast began to growl and made a move to attack. As soon as Georg saw this, he raised his gun and shot it just as it opened its jaws toward him. The moment their leader fell in the grass, the entire herd fled into the sea. Some scrambled away in such a panic that they hurled themselves 30 to 40 feet down jagged cliffs, seemingly without injury, likely because their thick, tough hides and the fat beneath, which tends to absorb impacts, gave them sufficient protection. Just as the crew took great pleasure in hunting these marine animals, the naturalists were equally delighted to observe and examine the curious behaviors of such sociable species. These creatures were in their natural climate and suffered nothing from the harshness of the weather. The fur seals and sea lions were perfectly insulated by their fat, while the cormorants and penguins were protected by their dense plumage. The captain had now achieved his goal. A sufficient stock of blubber had been collected and packed into barrels, ready to be gradually rendered into oil. For this gain, however, the men had to endure a foul, putrid stench, which lingered throughout the ship for several days after their departure from the New Year Islands. Toward evening, the men who had gone to New Year Bay on Statenland returned. They had found the location to be very convenient and secure, and brought back some gulls, along with 5 ducks with short wings, known as racehorses. Each weighed about 16 pounds, but their flesh smelled so repulsive that no one could eat it. January 2nd was also spent on various investigations ashore. Despite its small size, the island was rich in birds, and the men discovered several new species, including a very handsome gray partridge with a yellow neck. The island, however, was far poorer in plants. Its entire flora consisted of only about 8 species, including a few small bushes barely a meter high, of which just one was new. The bushy knotted grass, Dactylus glomerata, had spread across nearly the entire island. By evening the boats were brought back on board, and at 3 o'clock the following morning they sailed past the northeastern tip of Statenland, called Cape St. Johannes by Father Voyage, and out into the open sea.
The name Statenland goes back to the Dutch navigator Jacob Lemaire, who, together with William Schouten, discovered the region in 1616. Lemaire named the land after the States General, the Parliament of the Netherlands. It was later revealed that this was not a separate landmass, but the eastern coast of a large island. Today, this area is known as Isla de los Estados. The island belongs to Argentina and lies to the east of Tierra del Fuego. Tierra del Fuego, in turn, got its name from the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan. During his circumnavigation of the globe in 1520, he passed through the region and saw numerous fires along the coast, lit by the indigenous inhabitants. He named the area Tierra del Fuego, or Land of Fire. Today, Tierra del Fuego is divided between 2 nations. The eastern part belongs to Argentina, the western part to Chile.
During their stay at the New Year Islands, the men had noticed that the tide flowed with remarkable speed, covering roughly 4 to 5 nautical miles within an hour. This phenomenon, however, was nothing unusual, as the tides throughout the Strait of Magellan and along the southern coasts of America were known to be equally strong. The New Year Islands, from which they were now departing, lie at 54 degrees 46 minutes south latitude and 64 degrees 30 minutes west longitude. The largest measures about 11 kilometers in circumference, while the one where they had anchored was only between 5 and 7.5 kilometers around. The men could recommend these islands to sailors as the best place for rest and refreshment to be found in this part of the world. Though penguins and seal meat were no delicacies, they certainly offered a healthier diet than the usual salted provisions. During their excursions, they had also discovered some wild celery and scurvy grass. Since there were several islands, these herbs could likely be found in sufficient quantity somewhere to prepare nourishing, blood-cleansing soups for the crew. Fowl was so abundant that the sailors ate nothing but young penguins and cormorants for several days in a row. They even claimed that the cormorants tasted almost as good as chicken. Seal meat, too, was not to be despised. In very young animals it was overly soft and therefore repulsive, but the flesh of full-grown ones tasted better, about as good as inferior beef. Older bears and lions, however, were utterly inedible due to their foul smell. As long as daylight lasted, they sailed along the eastern and southern coast of Statenland, then set a course east-southeast in order to make another attempt southward. During the third summer, they were to spend on this hemisphere. The wind soon grew so strong that it snapped a top-gallant mast, but since it favored their course, they paid the damage little mind.
A topgallant mast is a part of the mast structure on a sailing ship. One can imagine the mast as a kind of tower divided into several sections. At the bottom is the lower mast, above it the topmast, and on top of that sits the topgallant mast. It forms the third and uppermost section of the mast. The topgallant sails are set from this mast. These sails are among the highest on the ship and are especially useful in light winds, as they can catch more wind higher up. At the same time, they were more difficult to handle since sailors had to climb very high to reach them. Thursday, January 5th, 1775, south of Statenland, at sea.
Today, a large ring or halo appeared around the sun. The inner field was dark, the edge bright, and the outer rim faintly tinged with rainbow colors. The sailors took this phenomenon as a sure sign of an approaching storm. Yet the weather remained mild over the following days, a fresh reminder that such omens are not always to be trusted. The ship had already crossed the 58th parallel without having seen any ice. On the evening of January 6th, at 8 o'clock, they therefore changed course and headed north. The presence of ice varied greatly by year. In 1700, for example, Dr. Halley had already encountered much ice at the same time of year as far north as the 52nd degree. On January 8th, a heavy evening dew was observed. This was traditionally taken as the most reliable sign that land must be nearby. The sailors found this assumption even more convincing, as they had often seen storm petrels, albatrosses, and seals since leaving Statenland. After reaching the 54th degree of latitude, they altered course again and sailed eastward in search of the land discovered by Monsieur Duclos-Guyot aboard the Spanish ship El León. He had departed from Callao, Peru, in February 1756, rounded Cape Horn in midwinter, and claimed to have seen this land. Seabirds continued to appear in great numbers, occasionally accompanied by penguins and floating seaweed. On January 14th, the officer on morning watch reported a floating ice island in the distance. The ships sailed toward it the entire day, but by evening it became clear that what they had taken for ice was in fact land. It rose to a considerable height and was almost entirely covered in snow. All signs suggested that this was the land Monsieur Guyot had named Ile de Saint-Pierre, whose southern point he had discovered in June 1756. In his journal, he had recorded the longitude as 38 degrees 10 minutes west of Greenwich. This matched perfectly with the position they observed at the island's northwestern tip. The southeastern point, according to their own measurements, lay only about 35 to 45 miles farther west. Some of their companions still refused to believe it was Guyot's island. They took it instead for a mere ice mass. The next day, a heavy fog set in, and the island disappeared from view. Along with the mist came violent storms and bitter cold. The thermometer read 34.5 degrees Fahrenheit. about 1.4 degrees Celsius, and snow lay deep upon the deck.
Monday, January 16th, 1775, South Georgia.
Early in the morning, the skies cleared again, and they caught sight of the land once more. The mountains were astonishingly high and, aside from a few bleak black cliffs and some hollow crags hanging over the sea, entirely covered in snow and ice, often right down to the water's edge. Not far from the southern tip lay a number of low islands which resembled the New Year Islands and appeared to be green with vegetation. They named them the Green Islands. As the main purpose of the voyage was to explore the ocean in high southern latitudes, Georg's father proposed to the captain that this land should bear the name of the monarch under whose command the journey had been undertaken solely for the advancement of science, so that his name might be carried with honor into posterity in both hemispheres. The suggestion was well received. The land was named South Georgia. What it lacked in fertility and charm would be compensated by the honor of the name it now carried. That afternoon, they sighted two rocky islands at the northern end of South Georgia, about 1.9 kilometers apart, which appeared entirely barren and desolate. Nonetheless, they sailed toward them and, around 5 o'clock, passed between the two. The northern island was a steep, nearly vertical rock, home to many thousands of nesting cormorants. It lay at 54 degrees south latitude and 38 degrees 25 minutes west longitude, and was given the name Willis Island. The southern island sloped more gently on its western side, where grass grew, and it served as a gathering place for countless birds of many species, from the largest albatross to the tiniest storm petrel. This earned it the name Bird Island. Great flocks of cormorants, penguins, divers, and other seabirds fluttered around the ship. At times, they settled on the water and seemed perfectly at home in this cold region. Porpoises were also seen, along with large numbers of seals, which evidently came to these barren shores to give birth. While daylight lasted, they continued sailing along the northeastern coast. At nightfall, they lay to and resumed sailing again at 3 in the morning. The land presented a wild and desolate appearance. The mountains were steeper and more rugged than any they had yet seen. The peaks were jagged, with every hollow between them filled with snow. After some hours, they passed a bay surrounded by several small, green-covered islands. They named it the Bay of Islands. Shortly afterward, another bay appeared, and they turned toward it, as the seafloor could be sounded everywhere, 2 to 3 nautical miles from shore, roughly 3.7 to 5.6 kilometers. Around 9 o'clock, the captain ordered a boat lowered, and together with a midshipman, Georg's father, Dr. Sparman, and Georg himself, he entered the bay. At its entrance, even the largest ships had nothing to fear, for a 34-fathom lead line, about 62 meters, did not reach the bottom. At the innermost point of the bay, they found a mass of solid, compact ice, similar to what is often seen in the harbors of Spitzbergen. This ice block resembled the floating islands common in the high southern latitudes. Though the shore was free of snow right at the sea's edge, the land itself was entirely barren and, in many places, fell away in steep cliffs. Still, they found a long protruding point of land where the boat could land safely. There, they went ashore. The beach was stony and crowded with seals, among which lay an enormous creature they at first mistook for a rock. Upon closer approach, they realized it was an Anson sea lion. As it was asleep, the young midshipman was able to kill it effortlessly with a shot to the head. Not far from it lay a younger animal of the same kind. Its entire body was dark gray, with an olive sheen, resembling the seals of the northern hemisphere. In this, too, it shared their features. The front flippers were less fin-like than the rear ones, and there were no visible outer ears on the head. The snout extended well beyond the mouth and was formed of wrinkled, loose skin, which the animal might inflate when enraged. At such a moment, it may well take on the comb-like shape depicted on the copper plate in Anson's Voyage. This specimen, which allowed close observation, measured about 13 feet long, roughly 4 meters, but was considerably slimmer than the manned sea lion of Statenland. In the same area, they also came across a group of over 20 penguins of quite unusual size. Each weighed no less than 40 pounds, around 18 kilograms, and measured 39 English inches, just under 1 meter in length. Their bellies were especially large and seemed to be covered with a thick layer of fat. On each side of the head was an oval, lemon-yellow patch, bordered in black. The entire upper part of the body was black, while the front and underside, even beneath the flippers, were feathered in pure white. These birds showed so little fear that at first they barely waddled away, even as the men clubbed them down one after another. Upon returning to the ship, they learned that this species had already been described by Mr. Pennant in the Philosophical Transactions under the name Patagonian penguins. They were likely of the same kind as those known on the Falkland Islands as the yellow or king penguin. The seals in this region were far more aggressive than those on the New Year Islands. While the latter fled at the sight of men, even the smallest pups here barked and chased after them, trying to bite. All of them were fur seals. There was not a single manned sea lion among them. To gain a better view of the surroundings, they climbed a small mound about 24 feet, roughly 7.3 meters, high. It was covered with two kinds of plants, the bushy knotted grass, common on the New Year Islands, and a type of burnet. Here, Captain Cook hoisted the British flag and carried out the absurd but customary ceremony of claiming these barren rocks in the name of His Britannic Majesty, his heirs and successors. 2 or 3 musket shots accompanied the ritual, echoing through the cliffs and striking terror into the true inhabitants of this new realm, seals and penguins, who trembled in confusion and fear. Thus, a pebble is set into the crown to replace a jewel torn from it. The rocks consisted of bluish-gray slate, lying in horizontal layers, though on the beach they were scattered about in broken fragments. As far as they could examine, the rock contained no minerals of value. From this side as well, the land proved useless, entirely barren and wild. They did not stay long, but returned to the ship with the seals, penguins, and cormorants they had killed. The bay was named Possession Bay, and it lies at 54 degrees 15 minutes south latitude and 37 degrees 15 minutes west longitude. While they were ashore, they saw small ice floes drifting seaward from the bay, and loud cracking sounds could be heard from the larger masses farther inside, presumably breaking apart. For the next 2 days they continued sailing along the coast, discovering various bays and capes, which were named in the following order: Cumberland Bay, Cape George, Royal Bay, Cape Charlotte, and Sandwich Bay. The land everywhere showed the same bleak character. Farther south, the mountains rose to tremendous heights, and the peaks were split into countless long, flame-shaped spires of rock. Mr. Hodges captured this view with great mastery in his drawings. On January 19th, they reached the southeastern tip of South Georgia and determined that the land was, in fact, an island about 50 to 60 nautical miles in length, roughly 93 to 111 kilometers. Not far from this point, at 54 degrees 52 minutes south latitude and 35 degrees 50 minutes west longitude, lay a rock they named Cooper's Island. Soon after, they discovered another island about 14 nautical miles, around 26 kilometers, further to the southeast, though its size could not yet be determined.
Friday, January 20th, 1775, southern tip of South Georgia.
That morning, they sailed toward the newly sighted land, having followed the southern coastline of South Georgia far enough that the Green Islands discovered on the 16th came back into view. For 4 days, the weather had been exceptionally clear, ideal for exploration. The wind was moderate, and the air mild. But no sooner had they left the coast than a violent storm broke out, accompanied by fog and rain, forcing them to take in the topsails. Fortunately, the storm did not last long, and by midnight the wind had fallen completely still. The new land toward which they were sailing was shrouded in fog, so out of caution they tacked back and forth continuously for 3 days. The dreary weather and strong wind still persisted. For safety, they sailed directly out to sea when, around 11 o'clock, Lieutenant Clerk suddenly spotted surf, breaking barely half a nautical mile, about 930 meters, ahead. At the same time, he saw several cormorants, which rarely stay more than half a mile from land. Only then did they realize that during the foggy days, they had unknowingly sailed all the way around the new land, and had been in extreme danger of shipwreck without even realizing it. At that very moment, as they became aware of the special protection they had received from Providence, the ship happened to be turning away from the coast, while the fog still alternated with dead calm. That evening, the weather finally cleared, and both South Georgia and the island they had unknowingly circled became clearly visible. The latter was small in extent, but surrounded by a great number of scattered rocks. This entire cluster of dangerous reefs was named Clerk's Rocks, after their discoverer. They lie at 55 degrees south latitude and 34 degrees 50 minutes west longitude. Early on the morning of January 25th, they set an eastward course, then slightly southward, and finally turned due south one last time before preparing to return to more temperate regions. It had long been claimed that every region of the world, no matter how desolate or wild, could serve as a dwelling place for mankind. Before arriving at South Georgia, they had no reason to doubt that belief. After all, even the icy coasts of Tierra del Fuego were inhabited by a people who, at the very least, had a slight advantage over animals. But in comparison with South Georgia, the climate of Tierra del Fuego seemed mild. Georg noted at least a 10-degree difference on the thermometer. Moreover, Tierra del Fuego produced wood and shrubs, just enough for the inhabitants to protect themselves from the weather, keep warm, and cook their food. South Georgia, on the other hand, had no wood at all, nor any other combustible substance. Georg considered it impossible for human beings, not frozen half-beasts, but rational Europeans equipped with all known means to survive there. Even in summer, the cold was so extreme that the thermometer never rose more than 10 degrees above freezing during their stay. And although it could be assumed that winter cold did not increase as sharply in the southern hemisphere as it did in Europe, there must still be a difference of at least 20 to 30 degrees. At most, a human being might endure the summer here, but the winter cold would surely prove fatal, unless he had access to other means of protection than what the land itself could provide. Besides its uninhabitability, South Georgia seemed to offer no products that would justify regular voyages from Europe. Fur seals and sea lions, whose oil had commercial value, were found in much greater numbers along the desolate coasts of South America, and on the Falkland and New Year Islands, where they could be hunted with far less danger. Should the whales of the northern Arctic ever be driven to extinction by yearly hunts, then perhaps it would be time to turn to the southern hemisphere, where they were known to be abundant. But even then, there would be no reason to sail as far as South Georgia, as long as they could be found in such large numbers along the coasts of South America, down to the Falkland Islands. The Portuguese, and even the North Americans, had already begun significant whaling operations in these waters. If South Georgia were ever to become important to humanity, that time lay far in the future, likely not until Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego were as densely settled and cultivated as Scotland and Sweden already were, in comparable northern latitudes.
This brings us to the end of this episode of The Journey. You can continue listening right away as the voyage unfolds step by step. If you'd like to follow the route on a map or see how these places look today, you'll find links in the YouTube show notes leading to the website. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support my work, you'll find a PayPal link there as well. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.